life show on YouTube, Into the Fringe, where we discuss lost civilizations, UFOs, cryptids, unsolved mysteries, megalithic structures, extraterrestrials, interdimensional portals, time skips, and more. Don't change that channel, because now you are leaving the mainstream and entering into the fringe. Greetings, followers. It is I, Cardinal Sin, and welcome to another episode of Into the Fringe with Micah Hanks. And Micah Hanks is a writer, podcaster, researcher, and speaker whose interests cover a variety of subjects, including history, archaeology, science, and the future of humankind. A longtime researcher and proponent of the scientific study of unidentified aerial phenomena, or UFOs, Micah has authored a number of books and has contributed many essays, articles, and blogs to various publications. Along with his podcasts, he has also worked as a narrator, lending his voice to several audiobooks, radio programs, and other recorded media projects over the years. Welcome, my friend Micah Hanks, back to Into the Fringe.
Good to be here. I figured, since you have your look, try to do a little look of my own tonight. What do you think, right?
A little voguing. Yeah. I think that's appropriate. Apropos, as they say.
Yeah.
And welcome, of course. And as people are rolling in, I just wanted to let you know, Micah, it is so good to see you. I'm really excited for the show tonight. And while people are rolling in, I wanted to mention again that you've generously agreed to give away an autographed copy of your book, The Ghost Rockets, to our lucky weekly winner, which is a must read. And thank you very much.
My pleasure, sir. It's always my privilege to be able to join you for some conversation and also to share one of my little tomes of knowledge for what that's worth.
Well, I think it's going to be a good one tonight. And also, it's storming pretty good here. So as long as I have a good internet connection, we should be okay. But you may hear some thunder. And in this part of the country at this time of the year, it gets pretty serious.
Yeah,
and
likewise. It's a little like
now,
that tonight.
Back in another lifetime, Micah, I used to put on UFO lectures here in Lawrence, Kansas. And I should do that again just to bring you to town so we have an excuse to meet in person and have a dad juice together.
Ah, there you go. Well, I think you're drinking coffee this evening, my dark beverage of choice. I've had to kind of lay off. I'm often doing coffee or tea at least during our evening interviews, but this is officially a Guinness. And that's both because it feels very much like Ireland outside tonight with the misty rain blowing, the cold moonlight landing on the moors, but also just for the hell of it. Because you know what? I was just telling Gil here before we began, ladies and gentlemen, that after a good 12-hour work day, I thought I'd have a dad juice. And that's, societal speak, which you picked up on that, by the way. I really know true friends when they know the lingo. And indeed, dad juice is just societal speak for beer. So here's to you, sir.
It's always a fine time to have a dad juice,
Yeah, you don't really need an excuse. But, Guinness has long been a favorite antioxidant-rich alcoholic beverage.
And it's vegan.
Yeah.
It didn't used to be vegan, and now it's vegan, so I can drink it again, which is great.
Yeah, and, I know this sounds kind of terrible, but they have some of the non-alcoholic draft pint cans now, and I've seen those, and I almost just wanted to try them just to see if the non-alcoholic variety had the flavor. It's not going to have all of, certainly not the kick, but then again, Guinness is very low alcohol. A lot of people who don't drink it often, I'll see them mention, I'll go to a pub or something, and if they've got it on tap, invariably I'll always have the Guinness, and I'll see people go, oh gosh, that's just a little too strong for me. And I'm like, well, what about it is strong? Is it the flavor? It's certainly not the alcohol content. It's only about 4%, which is low among most beers.
They used to call it liquid bread.
And because
actually it was a bread starter.
Yeah, and you can buy a Guinness. They've done their own branded bread starter kit like that, that you can buy. You can get it on Amazon,
I didn't
which
know
is
that.
yeah. So if you are someone who enjoys the flavor of that delicious pint, but you don't want that alcohol, you can just make the bread
And
instead.
sometimes, I just stick to water.
Oh yes, the old clear beer, and I have my bottle here. So
Now, let's say hello to some folks that have rolled in while we've been just yakking away. We have Herc 130. Hail, good to see you. Don McDouglas is here. Cam's Crash Courses is here. My good friend Skokely Yotun is here. Darius Munchausen is here, which is always good to see. Y Hutan is here. And we are going to let some more people roll in. And let's go ahead and get right into, Brian McCann is here. Masters Maniac Mexico is here.
goodness,
Cam's Crash Courses always recommends Bushmills Fighting Irish Whiskey, which actually is my whiskey of choice.
There you go.
So let's go ahead and dig right in. Now, I know that we have a lot of topics to get to today, but I wanted to ask you, Micah, how did your talk go last month at the International UFO Congress?
Well, I thought it went extremely well. It was a smaller group, which is still twice the size of many conferences that I attend. I mean, the International UFO Congress is usually one of the best attended events anywhere in the United States any given year. Well, and this year, although it was a low attendance for that event, it was still a pretty good sized event. We had a lot of fun. A lot of great folks were there. Of course, I got to meet for the first time some people who I've spoken to for years now, including Dr. Michael P. Masters, of course, who is the proponent of the extraterrestrial hypothesis and author of the book Identified Flying Objects. Dr. Lynn Katai was there. We also had, Travis Walton, who I've met many times, but somebody else I'd never met before and was eager to actually talk with in person was Bryce
Zabel.
Yeah. Bryce was there. And the minute he arrived, he'd gone right into the main ballroom to test his equipment, and I happened to be backstage, and so I was able to go right up and greet him. And Bryce, he knows everybody there, and he's been in this field for years, and it was so cool because he could have gone like, well, I'm going to go hang out, or I'm going to go catch up. No, he goes right up to me and he goes, you want to have a beer? And so the first thing he does after he tests his audio equipment, he says, let's go down to the lobby here and let's just catch up for a little while and have a beer. So Bryce and I go down and we had a beer and just kind of hung out and talked. And, it was super chill. And that was kind of the vibe the whole weekend really was. Everybody was pretty relaxed and just kind of enjoying themselves. Of course, there was a lot of after hours banter, but now some significant things were going on too. And yes, with all the things that have happened in the last few years, I've given a few talks at events, but I mean, this was I participated in a panel discussion that was in one of the event slots last year while we were still in the middle of COVID. And I was actually down in the UNESCO World Heritage Site, Chapada dos Veadeiros, in the middle of Brazil, quite literally in the middle of the country. And yet way out there in Alto Paraíso, the little town in the Chapada where I was.
Is that near Brasilia?
It's about 3 hours west of Brasilia. If you fly into the federal capital there, Brasilia, you'd get in a rental car and you'd drive about 3.5 hours west, and then you'd be in the Chapada. So I mean, you're quite in the middle of Brazil, and yet Dr. Krasinski was able to secure very, very fast internet at our location. And where I was, I mean, we had great upload speed, and so I was able to do the UFO Congress remotely from the middle of Brazil with the whole debrief team last year.
Wow.
That was super cool, but I mean, it's still not the same as being able to be there in person. So this year, putting on my full suit, including, by the way, the pocket scarf and the tie clip. Yeah, I had to go all out because I'm thinking, man, this is the event where you go all out. The talk I gave, past, present, and future potentials, began in medias res. We start with the events of the last few years, and then I went back in time, and then at the very end we kind of capped it with some future potentials, and it seemed to be very well received. So I was happy about that. But I mean, that was really just a footnote in the midst of all the other things that were going on, because we had two really great films that were premiering, essentially. One that was really premiering, James Fox's new film about the Varginha UFO incident, also a Brazilian case.
I've seen it. Excellent documentary.
Everybody was talking about that. And in addition to that, Randall Nickerson, my good buddy, I've become very good friends with Randall Nickerson through the contact I made with him. Chrissy Newton, of course, had been helping promote his film, and she introduced me to Randall. And again, he's really become a great friend of ours, and just a delight.
Chrissy's with the Debrief, right?
Yes, she is. Yes, she is our very talented media director. She also shared her first byline with me on a recent article that we published, which I'll tell you about here in just a moment, which has actually been a little controversial, and I'll tell why. But long story short, Chrissy introduced me to Randall Nickerson, and man, Randall is just a wonderful guy. And he actually won an award for his film on the Ariel School documentary. The Zimbabwe, the Rua UFO incident.
Right.
So that was really great. And seeing him win that award, he had no idea he was going to receive it. Somebody else who didn't know that they were going to receive an award was David Marler, who was the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award, Gil. And that for not only just the sum total of the incredible work he's done over the last few decades, but David made this big announcement about what is to be called the National UFO Historical Records Center. And this is going to be the largest single center for UFO information, historical primary source documents. I mean, this is going to be
like a depository.
Yeah, this is going to be the National Archives for ufology.
We needed one of those forever.
I'm actually I couldn't say anything last time we talked, but David had briefed me about the fact he was going to be dropping this information prior to the event. And when I got out there, I knew what was coming, but sitting there in the audience during his lecture, I mean, he got a standing ovation when his buildup was just so expert. David is so good at his delivery. And when he dropped the word, man, people literally jumped out of their seats and were clapping. And I was just thinking, attaboy. And so at the awards dinner, Alejandro and everybody are giving their awards, and David.
And that's Alejandro Rojas.
Alejandro Rojas, formerly of Open Minds, now of Enigma Labs, and also, of course, along with Karen Braid, one of the owners and operators of the International UFO Congress. But and also just a good friend of mine and the UFO community of many years. And not to mention, he and I do media relations for the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. So Alejandro and I work quite a bit together these days.
Maybe you can help me get him on the show sometime.
Well, he certainly should, because Alejandro is also just a wealth of knowledge. He's a great, talk about again another
UFO expert.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I have to put the air quotes. Somebody was talking about that recently. They had me on their show and said, it's great to talk to a UFO expert. And I said, there's no such thing, man.
That's right. Yeah.
But long story short, if there was one, Alejandro might be one, and David Marler would also be one. And when they announced his award at the banquet that evening, he got up and he walked right over to me and put his hand on my arm. And then he walked up on stage. And that really felt great, because I'm so proud of these guys getting that kind of recognition, for this incredible work. And despite all the stuff that we're seeing with the government and all these things, the International UFO Congress this year was an event for historians of the subject, for filmmakers like James and like Randall, for researchers like David Marler and Bryce Zabel, and so many others who were talking about classic incidents. I mean, there were several speakers who were talking about the Phoenix Lights, it being right there outside of Phoenix, Arizona. David, of course, always talks about the Battle of Los Angeles, but was also talking about a case from Hobbs, New Mexico in the 1960s involving an injury of a young boy who fortunately recovered. But I mean, it was a really strange incident. So with all these topics that looked back to the history of this phenomenon on the table, it was refreshing for me not for everything to be ad nauseum all about what's the Pentagon up to this week,
Right.
Or Roswell. Report again. Yeah. What do you think about that, by the way, them being late on this newest report?
It doesn't surprise me. I think it's the same shit, different day, if you will.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that you ran into some interesting people, and it sounds like you had a great time. Now, by the way, I've been meaning to ask you, have you heard anything about UFO sightings over the war in Ukraine?
Very little. There was that, speaking of controversies, that was that controversial Ukrainian study, which, and this is something we kind of pride ourselves in at the debrief. The story of the Ukrainian paper came to my attention via, my good friend, one of my best pals, Brett Tingley, who is a editor at space.com. And previously he'd been a writer for the War Zone, who basically brought to public attention all these Navy documents describing UFO-like technologies. And Brett found that paper and said, I thought about this for space, and our editors looked at it and they said, they want to wait a little while. They ended up actually publishing a piece about it as well. But Brett sent it along to us and said, I thought this might be a good one for the debrief. We do this, a lot of the time we're in communications about stories and sharing ideas and thoughts and things. I might pitch something at him that looks like a good space story that, although the debrief certainly covers a lot of that, they're the authoritative source for that kind of coverage. And so in this instance, he sent one along our way. And I just did a quick write-up about it because I'd reached out to one of the authors of the paper who at that time did not get back to us. And I didn't think much of it, but it took off like an atom bomb. It ended up being quite a big story. After we reported on it, though, there was a lot of misinformation unintentionally through, I hate to say, but lousy reporting. Several outlets were reporting that this had been associated with the U.S., studies in the Pentagon and the NASA stuff. It was not. It was basically three guys who were astronomers with the National Academy of Sciences in Ukraine. But it was their opinions and theirs alone. And so what ended up happening was a scientific panel was convened to look at this paper. And the guys kind of got a smack on the wrist and were told, the paper can stay online, but we mandate that you have to change the wording so that it says that you researchers, not the main observatory in Ukraine, right, you guys are the ones who believe that these things are UAP. And frankly, independent analysis by Mick West and others strongly suggests that a lot of those objects they called phantoms and whatever the other ones were, phantoms and cosmics, a lot of them are probably insects, birds. Avi Loeb has supposed that some might be bullets from the nearby conflict flying through the air. Yeah. So there've been a lot of, and Avi and I have corresponded about it a little as well, but in sum total, I just look at it and kind of say this is another instance where, I think people's imaginations got a little ahead of them. And so we reported on that. I did a follow-up article at the debrief where I finally did get a quote from Dr. Zilyaev, the primary author of that paper. And he essentially said that the attention that the paper was getting meant that he couldn't comment on it, but that a forthcoming paper would be in the works. And that was the last we heard, but I went to print with his quote because I thought that the quote actually said more than me trying to add any commentary beyond that. I let his bizarre quote kind of stand for itself. And thus ended the story of the Ukrainian UFOs. But apart from that, no, I haven't heard very much.
Interesting. Now, I have a feeling that we're going to go squatching a little bit tonight.
Oh, yeah?
And I've been a Bigfoot fan since I first read John and Pierce's classic book on the subject as a kid. Mm-hmm. Now, I understand that next weekend you'll be giving a talk at CrypticCon in Kentucky. What can you tell us about that?
Well, again, I seem to be just courting controversy at every turn these days. I'd mentioned the Ukrainian study and then also the minor controversy involving the co-authored piece that Chrissy Newton and I did at the debrief. That one briefly before we get to CrypticCon, controversial because it involves these pilot sightings of the so-called racetrack UAPs. And again, we reported on that story based on multiple sightings by pilots. And then Mick West reached out to me. And the cool thing about this article to me was that it put Mick and I in direct contact. We may have tweeted at each other in the past, but in this instance, he was tweeting at me and I emailed him. I got so lonely one night, I just had to reach out and email the guy. And look, you know what? Mick, he can be a little adversarial towards some people on Twitter. And I hate to say it, but I think a lot of those people kind of deserve it. But if you're respectful to Mick, he'll be respectful back to you. And he's been nothing but a gem to us. And frankly, that's always been my experience with Mick West. I think he's a nice guy. He's a very smart guy. And he admirably, and I said this to him, I said he admirably conceded that, not all of the pilot sighting descriptions match the Starlink hypothesis, but a majority of cases where video has been included in recent days of these pilot sightings do seem to be Starlink satellites. And with the methodology employed by he and a Metabunk user named Flarkey, they've demonstrated, and that's the key word, if you can demonstrate with the data that you can present not only a viable potential solution, but I mean an almost undeniable one, that's good ufology. That's great UFO research. Alan Hendry back in the 1970s in his UFO handbook was talking all about how you've got to be able to identify the IFOs so
That's
that
right.
so the residuum of UFOs you're left with can really be focused on and studied. And
The
even Mick
true
has said,
unknowns. Yeah.
and Mick has said if there are any true unknowns that are left, then that helps us study those. And I'm like, man, I'm right there with you. I do agree. But that generated some controversy because in addition to retweeting some of Mick's tweets about that and seeming to concede the point rather than doubling down and, fighting for the truth. We know these are UFOs and you
Right.
debunkers aren't helping. No, I said, look, I think you're right in this case. And so we've begun to plan a follow-up, which rather than saying, hey, you know what, everybody, those UFOs weren't UFOs. No, actually, the broader story now has become one of, look, guys, if pilots are seeing things they can't identify and they are readily identifiable if you know how to do it, what are the aviation challenges that arise from this? What does the FAA say about this? I reached out to the FAA and they gave me a non-response, but as is apropos and as I've done in the past, with the Ukrainian study, I'll go to print with what they give me to illustrate the lack of response, if nothing else. But I've got a great number of quotes from a lot of pilots, Ryan Graves, a lot of aviation experts, and we're going to report on the broader issue of, okay, how do we help pilots who are seeing things with an increasingly cluttered airspace? So anyway, controversy aside, Cryptid Con, why is that going to be the next one? Because again, it's strange to me with all this discussion about UAP, people take it really seriously. But you tell them that there's a potential monkey or an anthropoid ape that's an unrecognized species on planet Earth, and you are taken for a fool. And I've never understood. There's a tremendous disconnect there, Gil. It's like,
well, it's like I've said before, Micah. When we had Timothy Renner and all I can think of is Ecology of Souls.
Joshua Cutchin.
Thank you. When we had them on, and of course their books were about the paranormal Bigfoot issue. It was always about the UFO. Investigators would say, keep your Bigfoot out of my UFOs, and the UFO investigators would say, keep your UFOs out of my Bigfoot, or the Bigfoot researchers rather. And they really didn't realize how often these things happened in proximity to one another.
They do sometimes. In fact, Ben Hansen, who had been the researcher, who I'm sure many of you out there know Ben Hansen, but he had been the researcher who had been collecting these pilot sightings of the so-called racetrack UAPs. And he also happens to be giving a presentation at Cryptid Con that looks at those connections between UFOs and Bigfoot. Now, for my own part, and this with respect to Ben, because I like Ben a lot, he and I have become pretty good pals in recent days. Stan Gordon, a researcher who I respect the hell out of, and who's done,
me too.
He's done more than most people will ever do, like in their lifetimes. He'd probably done that in like the first 5 years, and he's been doing it for 50, 60 years now. I mean, it's just incredible the volume of data he's collected. But he's in books like Silent Invasion, he's put forward and he's not ashamed to say, I think that there's a connection between Bigfoot sightings and UFOs. Now, for me, it always comes back to, correlation does not necessarily mean that there's a causal relationship, right? Sometimes sightings of these things occur in similar regions. In fact, the guys over there at the Freakonomics blog several years ago did an analysis of that. Do you remember this? Yeah, they plotted UFO sightings and Sasquatch sightings and noticed a great degree of overlap between them. Now, some might read that as being, oh wow, look, see, clear. There you go. Even these guys doing this blog, these popular economists, they notice the correlation too. The whole premise of their article was, it's interesting that there is this overlap, but it seems like the common thread linking it all could be, population centers in rural areas where there are a lot of people, but you also have conditions, visible conditions, that are conducive to sightings or perceived sightings of things. Now, one thing I don't like, if it sounds like I'm being too skeptical, I even in recent days saw a
You, Micah, skeptical?
well, you got to be at
No,
least
I'm kidding, of course.
but every now and then you'll see people say really absurd things. Like in The Economist a few years, they tried to link UFO sightings to evenings when people were more likely to be drinking.
Right.
And therefore, now listen, I don't know.
Because everyone knows that dad juice creates hallucinations.
Yes, I very well may hallucinate and have an out-of-body experience, or at very least a hallucinogenic, trip while we're talking tonight as I sip
Drinking
on
your
this 4%,
Guinness. Yeah.
4% alcohol by volume, ladies and gentlemen, remember. So,
L'chaim.
But I mean, it's true that to say that Sasquatch and UFOs are linked just because the sighting regions tend to overlap, that's probably a misreading of the data, almost as egregious a misreading as The Economist trying to link UFO sightings with the time of day that people are drinking. Again, let's look at other factors here. Might this be because it's the evening and people are outside and they're at home and not at work and stuck in offices? Might this be because of any number of other factors?
Maybe looking up.
Maybe commuting, driving along the highway at night. I mean, there are any number of factors that don't involve alcohol. I mean, that's a silly, presumptuous.
Yeah.
And yet you see that often. In fact, there was a letter, an opinion letter written to the Wall Street Journal just a while back that made a similar ridiculous assertion about.
I think that's what Stanton Friedman used to call the noisy negativists, right?
Well, anybody can make a ridiculous presumptive statement that has no actual evidence backing it and then claim that there are correlations that seem to, when in fact that only displays their misreading of the data.
Right.
And a lot of people do that. Okay. But anyway, coming back to CryptidCon. So I for my own part, I leave the UFO and Sasquatch, leave them on opposite sides of the Fortean field. Not to say that there may not be a link at times. Who knows?
It could be opposite side to the 14 coin. Opposite side to the 14 coin.
Well, I mean, another
5 times fast with marbles in your mouth.
Look, another interpretation here. If we really want to get out there, if abductions occur and humans are abducted, why would we be so presumptive to think that humans are the only species on this planet that any potentially extraterrestrial visitors would take an interest in? I mean, if I were a visiting alien and I knew that there was a species that was very rare on this planet that was similar to humans, that even humans in large part didn't know about or chose to ignore and remain blissfully aware of or unaware of, I would take extreme interest in that if I had access, if I had technologies that would allow me to more easily find this creature. And I would certainly want to study, how does an animal that large remain hidden so well among these other primates? I mean, that would be a fascinating question for an alien. So any number of reasons.
It'd be a fascinating question for anybody, really.
Well, yeah, exactly. So, but at CryptidCon, one of the things I'm trying to do right now with my, and again, I'm like you, I'm unabashed in my interest in Sasquatch. I often say that the Debrief, for instance, is not a pro-UAP website. We're not.
Right.
But we are a pro-science applied toward UAP, news site that reports on the topic without, references to X-Files, little green men, and silliness. But the same is true, I think, for Sasquatch. And one thing that I think we've seen that's really kind of shifted the narrative in recent years has been the number of and the prevalence of government reports related to UAP and government investigations. Now, being a journalist who files a lot of FOIA requests any given day of the week, I've filed 2 or 3 this week alone. It struck me it would be very interesting, and I'm certainly by no means the first person to do this, but I think at this point I probably maybe filed as many or more FOIA requests related to Sasquatch than anybody I know. John Greenwald and I were on the telephone one day, and I asked him about the famous FBI Bigfoot file, and he had filed that because David Paulides had essentially asked him, why don't you file something to the FBI, see what you can get for me? And John said, I'm not a Bigfoot guy. I only did that because somebody asked me to. And since then, John's also gotten the famous Washington Atlas of animal species that was published, where they included an entry for Sasquatch in it in the 1970s. If anything, that might have just been a nod to the popularity of the subject at that time. But it is another example of a government document that features Sasquatch. Now, to me, a much more interesting approach would be a lot of people will file FOIA requests to the National Park Service and say, give me all your Bigfoot files. And invariably, Miss Wilson, the FOIA officer who sits there at the head office in Denver, will write back to you, and very politely and eloquently, as she always does, she'll write and say, well, could you be a little more specific? You know, they have occasionally turned over files with some, kind of brief mentions of Sasquatch type things to people, but there's not a whole lot you're going to get if you take
Sasquatch redacted, redacted, Sasquatch redacted, redacted.
Not even that much. I mean, honestly, the thing is, there's simply, in my experience, there are files that are related to this subject. Make no mistake. I've obtained a few, but you can't just go filing like a FOIA to the Park Service or U.S. Fish and Wildlife and say, give me all your Bigfoot files.
Sure.
What you have to be able to do is you have to find an instance where there were sightings, where you think there may have been a report that was filed, just like with any other kind of a FOIA. And back in the day, some researchers did have some success early on, just, appealing to the FBI and saying, we'd like all the UFO files. But if you recall what happened to Bruce Maccabee, although he got a bunch of them, I think he was also told that, if we gave you all the stuff that we had, it would cost like thousands of dollars. So you wouldn't be able
Didn't he work for the FBI anyway?
I think he had, right, as an optical physicist and an analyst. I mean, but he filed and successfully obtained a bunch of FBI documents, but was also told that, through routine clearing of their files, that they'd probably gotten rid of so many old files back in the day that people wouldn't have yet again been able to afford all the stuff they had at one time, which they shredded and got rid of. So the NSA wouldn't release their files to the Citizens Against UFO Secrecy. But again, these agencies did take a kind of more broad approach where they were just appealing or rather filing for UFO files. Nowadays, the agencies are pretty wise to that. And they will, if you ask, for the Sasquatch files or the UFO files, they'll kind of say, well, we need you to broaden or rather narrow the search criteria. Give us a date range and maybe a location that we can send it to that branch or office and have them look for what you want. But, they'll tell you straight up. Maybe some would call that a cop-out, and it kind of a lot of the time depends on the agency you're working with.
It sounds like they're being more helpful than they used to be.
Well, in a way, they are kind of helping researchers to narrow their scope of their searches so that they can find more specific data. And again, you got to keep in mind, in addition to the federal Freedom of Information Act, there are also on the state-by-state level what are known as Records Act laws, where you can file a Public Records Act request to law enforcement, to municipal,
in your own state or in specific states.
Yes, and each state's law is different, including, like, for instance, some states like Arkansas. If you are not a citizen of the state of Arkansas, you cannot request files from state and local government in that state.
Sure.
You have to be a citizen of that state to be able to.
Arkansasian.
Yeah, and so I've filed Records Act requests. That's kind of where I started with Sasquatch. Was yes, I've sent some requests to National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife. Certain branches of the military and even the Air Force, but that related to specific cases where I thought there might be documents.
Well, it's interesting that you bring this up, Micah, because you mentioned David Paulides before, and he started out as a Bigfoot researcher before he discovered sort of tangentially this missing 411 situation. And he still goes to the Bigfoot conferences in Denver and places like that, as I'm sure you're aware. But now he's got this documentary coming out in December, Missing 411, the UFO Connection. So now he's kind of stretching both ways. Yeah,
he's sort of stretching out. And listen, I got to give, kudos to David Paulides. Again, another guy who's become fairly controversial because he has become so big. He was at an event with us earlier this year, and I didn't even get a chance to talk to him at that one, but that was the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference. I'm sorry, that was last summer, actually. That was that was more than a year ago now. Gosh, okay, the time flies. So last year I was at that event with David. I saw him briefly, but we didn't really get a chance to talk. And the reason why is because, unlike at past events where he and I have been together and we have caught up, the line at Politis's table is, I mean, incredible. That guy brings like a small truckload of books with him and sells. It looks like he sells everything while he's there.
Several months ago, I went to his website. I think it's been 3 or 4 months ago now, and I went to his website and I ordered the 11 of his most popular books, including the map that has all of the areas on it that where these little missing people places are.
Mm-hmm.
And I still haven't gotten the books. So I think that he must be way behind on getting those books out. He's probably selling a great deal of books.
Oh, a tremendous number. And I also think that because you got to keep in mind, I mean, that your sales percentage if you sell through Amazon is going to be much less. And so he has worked very hard to maximize his profit. And again, I can't blame him at all for doing that.
Nothing wrong with that.
No, I mean, he knows that, if you sell through Amazon like I do, a lot of my books, I mean, you're going to get like, $2 or $3, for a $15 or $20 book. If he's going to put all that work into it, what David does is he prints his books and buys them in bulk, and then he ships them out himself and gets the full dollar value minus, his printing and shipping costs, which is a very smart way to run his business. And again, I'm glad that he is successful with what he does. But with that kind of success and attention, inevitably you're going to have naysayers. And so, I mean, a lot of people have been very unkind toward his theories about disappearances. And again, I have to say that unlike a lot of researchers, David seems to really take pains, has in the past at least, to really be careful about, insinuating that there's any kind of a connection with a lot of these disappearances. Now, with this UFO thing, and by the way, he was supposed to be at CryptidCon with us this year,
mm-hmm.
And couldn't be there because he is doing this documentary. So this is another opportunity I won't have to actually see David. But I want to thank him right here and now, because prior to the missing 411 stuff, and even throughout some of that, while he has, really taken off with missing 411, and that's become his main gig, he has continued to do a little work in the Sasquatch field, which has included a sort of side project of his where he has tried to collect some government documentation related to this. And he has been a great resource for me in, a little more, I've kind of devoted more of my Sasquatch attention to that, whereas he's been doing the missing 411 thing. So he's provided some great resource materials with regard to interviews he's conducted with people, a few documents he's gotten. And I've kind of tried to take more of an approach like how I would do things over at the debrief when we're investigating a UAP case, file FOIAs with related federal or state agencies, see what turns up. And then a key to the Sasquatch thing that is unlike the UAP thing is that UAP appear to be a technology, and they are detectable with technologies like radar and other sensory capabilities. And thereby, every now and then, government records are going to be kept about those sensing incidents, those incidents where sensory data was collected. And that's always been the case, and even just eyewitness cases. Because again, if you see a Sasquatch, the military looks at it and says, okay, somebody says they saw a monkey. If you see a UFO, and the military looks at it, they say, okay,
somebody saw a light in the sky.
Well, or they saw a structured object. And I mean, if it was the Cold War, they may say, is this Stalin, or the Russians, the Soviets? Are they flying over our airspace? Is this somebody else?
Coming over the pole. Yeah.
Well, these have always been questions when it comes to UFOs, and that's no different about the narrative today. So, yes, it's easy to see why the military takes more interest in a technology than it would in a purported undiscovered species. Great. People say they're seeing a monkey out there. I can rest assured and tell folks that if military officials discovered Sasquatch tomorrow, they're probably going to be like, great, one more problem we don't need right now. Bag it, book it, hide it, don't tell anybody. If it's UFOs, they're like, okay, we got to kind of pay more attention to this because this is something.
Bag it, tag it, lose it.
Well, yeah, but again, as little interest in having to involve themselves in UAP investigations that the military has, but they do it nonetheless because, okay, this warrants attention for national security concerns and what have you. When it comes to Bigfoot, I don't think they're going to see a national security concern. They're probably going to have as little to do with that as possible. Now, all that said, you do find some records about Sasquatch, and the importance, I think, of obtaining those all comes down to the effect that doing so with UAP has had culturally. When you find authoritative source material from a government source related to a subject, people who have been like, this all just sounds like a bunch of nonsense. I mean, with UAP, it's kind of made a lot of people who once had that opinion go, maybe there is something more to this, as extraordinary as that idea might have seemed at one point. And whatever the provenance of these objects is, I mean, this was something we all just laughed at, and now more people take it seriously. I'd love to see the same happen with Sasquatch, and even if the government agencies that randomly, occasionally do collect data about this, even if they don't necessarily take it seriously, if it was serious enough at the time in any given instant that there were reports filed, and people see that, okay, well, the government also has produced official reports and documentation related to this subject also,
Right.
it may help compel some people to understand, okay, this is an issue that is not just, hillbillies in the woods, screaming at each other, claiming they're seeing things. Even federal agencies, and this is most important, employees in those agencies describe things that they've seen. And again, you got to keep in mind, there's no official reporting structure as far as how to report a Sasquatch sighting. Many park officials and people I've spoken to say, I didn't file any official report. I didn't think there was any reason to. It was my personal sighting of something, and I thought it was interesting. But others
a lot of people don't know where to report such a sighting.
They don't,
or even that such a place exists.
I just recently been corresponding with a former park naturalist in an Oregon. Well, I mean, there's only one, actual national park in Oregon, and that's Crater Lake. So, that kind of gives away the secret. But he had been a park naturalist there in the 1970s, and he saw an upright walking creature cross the road in front of his vehicle. And I had filed FOIAs about this because I found it in a sort of unofficial history of the park that two rangers had been keeping for and I wish every national park had historians who just for the love of history did like these guys did.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, they were twin brothers, Lloyd and Larry Smith, and they just were they love the names of some of the monuments out there in Crater Lake National Park. Like I think there's like there's a big stone out in the middle of the lake. First of all, Crater Lake is not a crater. It's actually a caldera of a collapsed volcano. That there are oral traditions among indigenous Americans in that region that still convey what appear to be cultural memories dating back more than 7,700 years when this eruption occurred, the remembrances of that event. And excavations under the ashen layers that were left by the volcano have also revealed artifacts where it's clear that there were people there and who would have been observers at the time of this incident. So, I mean, that's fascinating in itself.
It is.
But as a result, the caldera is, I believe, the deepest lake in North America. There are no rivers or streams that feed into or out of it. It all is just snow melt and rain that collects in this basin, and it holds this water. And so it has a very unique appearance. It's because of its depth. It's just incredibly, shockingly almost blue. There's this great big stone out there in it, and they call that the Phantom Ship. So there are all these very unique names associated with the park, and Larry and Lloyd just were fascinated with these obscure little bits of history about how these locations got their name, and they started logging on little note cards, little bits about the history of the park. And so as I was going through that history of that park, because it's a Pacific Northwestern National Park, I thought there's a good chance we may find something interesting. And sure enough, there were 3 entries, one from 1976, but it turns out that incident occurred in 75, one from 78, and then another from the 1980s involving Sasquatch sightings at the park by park officials, and in one case, a motorist who was just driving along. But there's a log that floats called the Old Man. I just saw that. But yeah, the sightings were interesting. I filed a FOIA request about what the chief naturalist saw. They said, we don't have anything. We don't keep files more than 40 years. But lo and behold, I reached out to the Smith brothers about their history, and they say, you're talking about George Morrison. He was the chief naturalist back then. Heck, we still keep in touch with George. He's in his 80s now, but he'll email you. And you know what? He did. And
wow.
so I was able to get a full recollection, not only of his account, but he said, after I saw my account, I started investigating others. And here are 5 other incidents I investigated in that park involving, one was footprints that were left at a nearby area. One was a sighting by a snowmobile, like a snowblower driver, who had said he saw 2 what he thought were bear, but they stood straight up and walked across the road, slid down, and went up a bank and into the woods. I mean, some great sighting reports. Now, the bottom line is, even where the FOIA fails in those instances, sometimes digging around in records will lead to accounts, and then you can, if those people are still alive, you can track down those personnel. And I have dug up so many reports. You talk about, sightings reports. Crater Lake's fascinating, but the real hotbed of Sasquatch reports where park personnel have seen them is Yellowstone.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, let me tell you, I mean, Bob Action Jackson, the legendary seasonal park ranger, who was he would ride the thoroughfare on horseback. The thoroughfare, for anybody who doesn't know, by the way, is this tract of land out there in the backwoods of Yellowstone that is the furthest that you can get from any road in the contiguous 48. And, and Yellowstone is able to have land like that because it was the first national park in America. It was our very first, and it's still one of the largest. Now, it's not the largest anymore. I think there are larger parks in like Alaska, but it's still a large park. And so in the contiguous 48, the thoroughfare is one of the most remote areas there is.
It's in 3 or 4 states, isn't it?
Wyoming, and I think a little bit of Utah, and then I think a little bit of would it be Colorado? Or yeah, maybe so, yeah. But in any case, most of these sightings occur in the Wyoming corner. And I mean, I've uncovered a lot of them, but Bob Jackson, this thoroughfare ranger, he'd been out there one day, and he, looking down the hill in this glade, observes a deer shoot out of a meadow. And then he says out of the other, or it was rather kind of a thicket, it shoots out. And then out the other side, he sees on 2 legs, a dark figure with swinging arms go running out, and it runs diagonally from position of cover to position of cover. And he said, I'd never seen an animal do that. He said a grizzly bear will always, first of all, they don't run on 2 legs. The second of all, he says they'll always go in a straight line. And he says this thing was obviously intelligent and trying to remain concealed while it ran on 2 legs, completely hair covered, And I mean, these guys are not like Bigfoot proponents. They're people who probably never thought twice about Sasquatch until they saw the damn thing out there, So those kind of reports, though, are fascinating to me. So again, unlike UAP, where we have military personnel, but also a lot of records, you don't have as many records in the Sasquatch camp. But boy, let me tell you, you certainly have those federal and state employees. Don't forget law enforcement, too. People who have had those encounters. And those, again, I hope will form the basis of a different kind of inquiry into this subject than what we've seen in years past.
In the chat, Colonizer Jeeba says, Crater Lake was protected by a giant and his wife. The natives asked for help against the Polwudgies who were terrorizing them. The giant caught as many as he could and shook them until they forgot.
Is Polwudgie, is that maybe a reference to Puckwudgies?
Yeah, could be.
Yeah, I've known some Puckwudgies in my day.
Yeah, probably met more of them than I'd like to.
Yeah, they can. And and I'll just come back really quickly to another point about the government thing. And of course, if I haven't spelled it all out yet, I mean, that is going to be the focus of the lecture at CryptidCon. I'm going to touch on the history, because the history of the Sasquatch subject is vitally important too. But the government side of it, again, if we look at the reason why a lot of UFO researchers rely on that government data, it's because government documentation related to UAP provides a very good primary source of information for UFO history. And arguably one of the best. There have been several, but one of the best culminations of that kind of data in recent years was Dr. Michael Swords and Robert Powell's book UFOs and Government, where relying primarily on government documentation, they put together like a textbook. It literally looks like it could be like a college textbook, but it's all about UFOs, and it's all basically just related to government documentation, telling the story, relying almost exclusively on government documentation and reports or interviews with those personnel. And that's a really unique perspective on the phenomenon, where you're not getting a bunch of sensationalism and conjecture and speculation. It's just a no nonsense kind of report on the history of the phenomenon. See, with Sasquatch, we get so far out there because people start speculating about quantum abilities and interdimensional phenomena and things like that. And for all we know, the creature very well may be not a creature, but in fact a time traveler or a time warper or whatever else.
It could be anything.
Maybe dropping down on UFOs like we were talking about earlier. But again, I'm one of those guys who kind of in the tradition of Loren Coleman, Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum,
Absolutely.
I don't consider myself a strict materialist by any means, but I am. Well, I don't like to put a label on myself. I'll just try to say that, I
think I heard you describe once as a hopeful skeptic. Is that right?
I'm a hopeful skeptic, but more than that, I'm also, I guess, I just try to follow empirical data more than anything else.
Yeah.
And I enjoy, speculations about interdimensionals as much as the next guy.
But go where the science leads, not follow your bias.
Look, I do that first, and I not to the exclusion of data that doesn't meet those criteria, but I try to stick with the data, because sometimes it's not so much that the data takes you to places where science doesn't go. It's rather the case, I think, that when data is improperly collected or there isn't enough of it, speculation fills those gaps and leads to misinterpretation.
Right.
And so you don't exclude the data that doesn't conform to your narrow view of reality, but what you do is you work with the best data sets that help you form a clear picture. And so when it comes to UFOs or Sasquatch or anything else, these topics that people laugh at you for discussing because, again, no respectable science is going to look at, Sasquatch. This is nonsense. Well, I differ on that point, vehemently, because I look at humans. I watch apes in zoos, and I watch their behavior. And I'll look at their appearance, and I think about, okay, somewhere between those silverback gorillas who, they do the chest beating, and they'll stand up on their hind legs and they'll walk around and they'll kind of like do their little intimidation displays for everybody, And it's almost like with the viewers there at the zoo, it's almost like they know what they're doing. It's like they know they're putting on a show, and they'll get up and I'm like, look at this massive ape whose arms are like 4 times the width of mine. And he's walking around on his hind legs, and he's chest beating, and he's doing all these things. And I'm like, so much of that, I can almost imagine a Sasquatch. I can almost imagine, based on the eyewitness descriptions, what so many people say they have actually observed. What is so hard to imagine about that, apart from the unexpected discovery of that kind of species in North America? That's the hard,
especially when you hear things like, chimpanzees and human beings share 95% of the same DNA. Well, if there is such a thing as a Sasquatch, what if it's 98%? What if they have opposable thumbs? I mean, the speculation could just be rampant.
Yeah, it's hard to know really exactly evolutionarily where you place Sasquatch based on the descriptions, because, if the Patterson Gimlin film is authentic, and and
the 21st century digital remapping of it, so that they take the camera shake out, you can see the muscles under the skin and everything. It's unbelievable.
I gotta say, it looks pretty good, and I've got a lot of friends who don't follow this subject, I guess, quite like I do, who Well, offhandedly, when I bring up that film, they'll say, "Oh, I should tell you, man, just before you go too far with this, the guys came forward a few years ago, and it's a hoax." And I'm like, "Oh, really? Well, I'm glad we've cleared that up.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
How I managed to miss that, I guess I'll never know."
Bob Hieronymus said that he hoaxed that, I think 20 years ago.
There's been a lot of, sorry, with the yawning, by the way, the time change is still kicking my butt just a little bit.
Well, and only 12 hours of work beforehand? Come on, Micah.
12 hours. Well, it was a long day because what I do is I'll do my work that I have to do, and then I'll do my pleasure work, which is like a research project or a writing project that's something I want to do. And I carved out an extra 4 hours to work on what I hope will be a book project on some of these subjects related to Sasquatch at some point in the weeks or months ahead. And so they say, don't complain about not having time, make time. Okay, I made time, but now I'm tired, and plus it's like daylight saving time.
Right. I hate daylight saving time. Even when you fall back, it's just it drives me crazy.
Well, it's just really silly to me. I mean, and one of the recent studies I was looking at seemed to determine that, I mean, it's not really helpful to do this, because all that ends up happening is exactly what's happening to me right now, as people end up like losing out on sleep. It's like, just pick one time and stick with it.
It causes more heart attacks, more stress, Yeah, I mean, I don't think that, farmers getting up earlier, or I think maybe one of the excuses I heard had something to do with the war. I mean, come on, that's 70 years ago. Or kids walking to school having more light or something like that. I mean, it's darker now than it was a week ago,
It just, to me, it doesn't make all that much sense. And the other thing, too, is it also superficially has the appearance of getting brighter earlier. And therefore, when it gets brighter earlier, I thereby, I tend to not be able to sleep as well. Because
and we already have problems sleeping, don't we, Micah?
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, tell me about that. Again, one more reason I'm not doing the coffee tonight. But anyway, so when it comes back to the subject of well, actually, coming back now, I got to try and remember where in the rabbit hole we actually were there for a moment.
Right.
Because I know Sasquatch and government, of course, has been kind of our primary target tonight. But I would like to. And, anthropology was the other side of this, too. Coming back to the chest beating thing, though, that I've been discussing there for a moment.
Behaviors, yeah.
Well, yeah, this is an interesting kind of a little rabbit hole to go down, because if you look back at some of the early accounts, the Micmac once described the creature, which, again, some of the cultural names they would use would be Witico or Wendigo. And a lot of people say, oh, no, that's not a Sasquatch. No, this was a mythological cannibal giant that was, obviously a creature, and they believed that humans could turn into this thing. That wasn't a Sasquatch. Well, maybe in some cases it wasn't, but you got to keep in mind that, I mean, there are variant spellings and variant traditions and variant in various regions. When you look at, there was a paper, and the author, I could pull it up here in a moment, but the title of the paper was called "Witico among the Tete." Let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and pull it up so we can see this, because I want to be able to.
While you're doing that, we've got in Australia, we've got the Yowie.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah. In Canada, I think they've got 2 or 3 different names.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. And again, note that there are some similarities between those names. For instance, Yowie in Australia, Yahoo you sometimes see, Yeren in China. There are other similar names too, but I've always been interested.
And in Russia, I think they have a similar name.
Yeah, Alma, Almasty. Yeah, there are even some other names too. Here's the article that I've been referencing. It's called "Witico Among the Tete de Boulay" by Reverend Joseph E. Guinard. And this is basically Witico among the Tete de Boulay and Algonquin-speaking people of the upper St. Maurice River in Quebec is a fabulous monster, a species of giant cannibalistic man. And then he notes the different names that they have for this creature: Witico, Cocoche, Achen, and different other names as well. But the interesting passage comes later in the paper where they note the voice of the Whiticos was strident and frightful, and more reverberating than thunder. The sound of his voice was long, drawn out one, accompanied with fearful howls. When the people heard it, everyone fled to the woods and swamps looking for a safe place to hide. Now, I'll just note on that point, that's still very consistent with modern conceptions of, what a Sasquatch call is supposed to sound like. But the account goes on to say his food was rotten wood, swamp moss, mushrooms, corpses, and human flesh. When a Witico happened upon the trail of anyone, he waited until darkness fell to go eat the luckless victim. When the Witico had arrived close to the tent of his victim, his heart beat twice with joy upon his breast, making a sound like that which grouse make when they drum. Fascinating encounter. And in fact, actually, I'm going to see if the audio will come through and play, because I've got an audio soundbite I want to feature really quickly of.
Okay. Yeah, you can share that as long as it's not going to get me a copyright strike, because that'll be my third one, Micah, and that means they'll delete my channel.
Well, you know what? You shouldn't do that, actually. Well, you know what? Let's play it safe then, actually, because this is actually an audio soundbite from a video which is on YouTube, and sometimes they'll arbitrarily still do a copyright strike. So
yeah, a copyright notice is one thing. A copyright strike would be goodbye, Cardinal sin.
Well, we don't want to do that. Yeah, and trust me, I've been down that road where I had permission to play certain songs on my show.
They don't care.
Yeah, you still have to battle. You have to battle
YouTube.
They'll do it to you. So, well, I'll do my best to emulate the drumming of the grouse. Okay, so when he starts to beat his little wings, the ruffed grouse goes just like that, and then they stop.
I like that little polyrhythm.
Yeah. And this is when they start flapping their wings, but they start woo, 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 and then they go faster. And it's obviously very similar to the sound of like chest beating that primates produce. Mm-hmm. Now, it was a fascinating account in a book from the 1960s, but it was actually written about a series of events that occurred back in the 1920s and 30s. The author was M. Wiley Blanchett, and her book was called The Curve of Time. And, I bought a copy of this in ebook format so that I could read one paragraph in the book, although actually much of the book is worth reading. The story is that she was a widowed mother who had a bunch of little children, and she puts the kids in a boat and they go sailing up the Pacific Northwest one summer, and they stop at various abandoned indigenous American settlements, and they stop at, places they camp most of the time, but they also spend some time at little bed and breakfasts and things. And it's just like an account of their journey up the Pacific coast. But at one point, they were at an inn where they sit down at dinner and they meet an old hunter. And this hunter tells them about the scariest night he'd ever had. And the scariest night he'd ever had, he said he had to sit with his back.
A campfire story.
Yeah. His campfire story was, he said, I had to sit with my back up against a rock wall inside a cave with my gun drawn while two grizzly bears walked around out in front of the cave beating their breast. Like grizzlies do, right?
Yes, like grizzlies are wont to do. Yes.
Yeah. Well, again, and his account was, he says these two grizzlies walked around in front of the cave on their hind legs beating their breast all night, and I couldn't get out of the cave. They were mad because they'd come home and found me in their cave, and I'm thinking, buddy, I don't think those were grizzlies.
Yeah.
But, again, at that time, a hunter who might have only come across legends every now and then about, Zonqua or, the box or whatever other name, Siatix.
Orang Pendek.
Yeah, whatever name any Pacific Northwestern tribe might have given to one of these, creatures. If he was unfamiliar with those names, and he thereby chalk that all up to myth, and he was going to only deal in the world of animals he knew to have existed. Sure, okay, there were two big hairy things walking around beating their chest outside my cave last night. I'm going to go with
black bears.
Yeah, I'm going to go with bears. Yeah, that was his best guess, and probably fell a little short of the mark. But the point I'm trying to make is that we see a really interesting crossover from indigenous American traditions that describe what sound very, again, the other one that I'll mention here, I talked about the Micmacs. It was an excellent article published in the Info Journal back, I think, in 1976 by Mark A. Hall and, of course, the great Loren Coleman. And in their account, they note that
Great
among
cryptozoologist.
great, and again, this is back in the 70s when the guys probably were in their 20s or 30s, and they did a great kind of collection and analysis of all these different native traditions that might involve Sasquatch. And here's a quick entry. Among the Micmac, a group located in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, are references to the Gugwas. These cannibals have big hands and hairy faces like bears. If one saw a man coming, he would lie down and beat his chest, producing a sound like a partridge. So there are lots of references to, and that one very specifically, a creature beating its chest and producing a sound like the drumming of a partridge. Now, why wouldn't they just say, oh, it sounds like a big gorilla, doing chest beating? No, they
it's interesting that you mentioned that, because when we were talking about where the footprints end with Joshua Cutchin and Timothy Renner, they mentioned what great mimics Sasquatch are. And we got into things like crybaby bridges and the different sounds that Sasquatch would make to either repel human beings away or to attract them. And I'm sure that you're familiar with all these different kinds of sounds. I found the crybaby bridges thing very interesting.
That is interesting. And, somebody I spoke to a few years ago about this was Smokey Crabtree, who Smokey was the guy who was actually featured in the film The Legend of Boggy Creek at one point. You see him walking out of the store with a great big, kind of like an Elmer Fudd looking hat on. But he wrote a couple of books about he and his family's involvement, in fact, with the so-called Falk monster. And I called him up and spoke to him back in the day when I was in radio. And, Smokey was a nice old guy, and he would, sign his books and mail them to you and even talk to you on the phone for a minute. But I remember
this was pre-internet, right?
Well, the internet existed, but I mean, Smokey was very much a man of the pre-internet era, I will say. And so I found somebody had put up, I guess, a website for him that had like a phone number that you could call. And so I called the phone number, and sure enough, Smokey picked up, and I talked to him for a minute and ordered a couple of his books. But he had this package that you could get where, you could get his 2 books about the Falk monster and then an audio CD, and some guy with one of these rich country voices. He had done the Legend of Smokey Crabtree country song. And
it's Bigfoot.
Yeah. So I mean, this guy.
I used to have that 45 when I was a kid. I think Ari handed that down to me when I was a kid.
Oh yeah,
the Bigfoot record. It's Bigfoot.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Lock your doors and lock your windows. Bigfoot's on the prowl.
Well, there are definitely some very funny songs and musical selections that reference Sasquatch and other things that have been written over the years. But
why do you think, Micah, that all of these different accounts of Wendigo and Bigfoot and all these different creatures that you've been mentioning talk about them as cannibals and reference them as cannibalistic?
Well,
I mean, was there any evidence to that effect?
The first thing I think that should be understood is that, there are going to be a lot of scholars who will say, well, hold on, guys, you're getting ahead of yourselves. Wendigo was not Sasquatch. Wendigo was something else. That's true. Not all representations of Wendigo seem to be a match for Bigfoot, and by any stretch of the imagination. So to try and break this down, it seems to me that there are many instances where Witico, Wendigo, or whatever other various names associated with some of those creatures in some cultural traditions, some of them display characteristics that are undeniably primate behaviors, like the chest beating and things like this, and or characteristics that are commonly associated with modern reports of Sasquatch. In which case I say, some cultures may have been of the mind that when they heard those things, they didn't know what the creature was. I mean, look, by today's standards, I mean, you couldn't really argue that people see Sasquatch all the time. You know, Cliff Barrickman and some of the guys I've spoken with will say, you know, at this point, we just kind of think of it like it's another animal. And, you know, there's not even anything really all that fascinating about it. And I'm like, are you kidding me? These things are giant and they remain hidden incredibly well. So, I mean, we hear the jokes about world's greatest hide and go seek champion, but I mean, that to me is almost a superpower. I don't think there's necessarily anything paranormal behind that, but it's definitely something, a unique adaptation that these creatures have that is worthy of understanding. But if in ancient times, in prehistory, you know, pre-European contact, they were very much still the same way, and indigenous Americans did occasionally see these creatures, but they didn't necessarily have all that much more information about them than you or I have today.
Right.
They may not necessarily have quote unquote ID'd this animal. They may have said, you know, we see these things from time to time. According to any given tradition, they may say they are our brothers. They are a type of forest people. I mean, they walk
That's
upright.
a tribe. Mm-hmm.
It would have been natural, and many cultures did this. They would say, you know, they are a tribe that you know doesn't have any kind of connection to us or any kind of contact with us. They wear, you know, bear skins that cover their whole bodies, and that they live way up in the high mountains. You see that, you know, that kind of language in the traditions. So my speculation is that, you know, if these creatures indeed engaged in a kind of howling call, and I'll point out Bob Jackson, the thoroughfare ranger that I mentioned earlier, who had that full, you know, full blown like
History.
daylight
Mm-hmm.
sighting. Just a few weeks before his sighting, he and another park ranger said that they had heard a long howling call that he said just went on forever. You know, and he said we had never heard anything like this before. And he said he heard it on at least one other occasion, and he said that the second time it happened was a few years later, but at that point he had been ready because he was, if I ever hear this again, he says, I'm going to be ready. And he immediately got his watch and he clocked it at like 20 seconds nonstop, this long howl. I found an article, I think, from Vancouver, Washington from the 1930s describing how locals have begun to hear the long wolf-like howls associated with the Sasquatch.
Mm-hmm.
Well, again, you know, we go back to the article by Joseph E. Guinard, which was published in an old journal called Primitive Man, which, again, a title like that for a journal wouldn't really pass by today's standards. But nonetheless, that was the journal where this was published back in the day. The voice of the Whiticos was strident and frightful, and more reverberating than thunder. The sound of his voice was a long, drawn-out one, accompanied with fearful howls. I mean, you couldn't get a better description. So my guess is that
it kind of gives you shivers just hearing about it.
Well, yeah, but again, that description, much like the chest beating, much like the hair cover, you know, much like the scent associated with them, I mean, there are a lot of behaviors that are consistently described. My guess would be that if they had a belief in a cannibal giant that was imbued with supernatural powers and they hear a howling scream off in the distance, they're going to go, yep, that's a Witigo. That's a Wendigo, you know. So, you know, I think that we start seeing this sort of kind of blending of, you know, beliefs about an animal which fell into the so-called low information zone. You know, even early indigenous Americans probably had a very limited data set. I doubt that they knew all about Sasquatch. I mean, they may have known, like, yeah, those things are real. Yeah, we see them. Here's the time of year you see them. People see them every year. Yeah, I don't doubt that. But I mean,
they're all in their different areas, you know, apart from each other.
These were a very different kind of animal than the ones that they were used to dealing with. And cultural traditions, I would hazard to guess, seem to reflect that uncertainty. Yes.
Yeah.
So, but, you know, again, to me, looking at the indigenous American mythology, much of which was collected beginning in the mid-19th century and then carrying over into the early 20th, it's really important. Let's see. Let's see if we lost him. Because I know we've got some weather hanging around, lingering over the Cardinal this evening. Looks like I'm still on the broadcast here, ladies and gents, but just stand by, because if we have to, we'll bring in the French mimes and some music. One thing's for certain, dear Cardinal, if you can hear me or not, we don't need you here for me to keep discussing all sorts of things. Gil, have we got you audio only now? Yeah.
No, I'm still here.
Okay, we got you. There you go. Yeah, I was going to say I was afraid that the weather may have taken you down there. Okay.
There we go. I think the weather did take me out for a second there. I apologize.
Yeah, that's quite all right. I thought it could get, dare I say, hairy there for a moment.
Well, yes, but I'm bummed.
The great thing about StreamYard, though, is that, if you got a couple of people on that broadcast, it will stay online. It doesn't take the broadcast down with you.
It actually upgraded my StreamYard somehow. I've
Oh,
got
really?
a new little widget that I didn't used to have.
Oh, well, that's kind
And
of nice.
it shows 2 bars, whatever it is. So,
Well, I hope
in any
that's good.
case,
Oh, that sounds probably like a some sort of a connection gauge or something.
yeah. Oh, now it's gone. Easy come, easy go, I guess.
Let's just hope that your connection holds true. I don't think it's raining quite as badly here where I am. So, anywho, where we left off, my friend, if I may indulge you and the
Please
listenership,
do.
I've got one more account that I thought I'd share. Well, actually, I'll throw two in here because I'd said the 19th century, but one of the earliest accounts that I've found goes all the way back to 1792. Jose Mariano Mozino. He had traveled up the Pacific coast, and he writes about this in a book where he describes his encounters with the Nootka tribe, Noticias de Nootka, an account of the Nootka Sound in 1792. But this is a translation of the account that he recorded. He said, "I do not know what to say about Matlocks, inhabitant of the mountainous district, of whom all have an unbelievable terror. They imagine his body is very monstrous, all covered with stiff black bristles, a head similar to a human one, but with much greater, sharper, and stronger fangs than those of the bear, extremely long arms, and toes and fingers armed with long curved claws. His shouts alone, they say, force those who hear them to the ground, and any unfortunate body he slaps is broken into 1,000 pieces. I presume the story of Matlocks has the same foundation as that of the creation of man, to which I have just referred." And he's, of course, referencing an earlier passage in the text. "Or that from the most ancient times, the tribe to which these natives owe their religion received some account of the existence of demons." So now this is a pretty common theme that you encounter where they will try to argue that, whatever tribe these people receive their traditions from might have told them about something that sounds like Matlocks. But that description, yet again, the black bristles, which again sounds like a description of stiff, kind of wiry hair, the long arms, the screams, the shouting that will bring a man to his knees. The descriptions are actually quite good. The best one, though, arguably,
Hair-raising, if you'll pardon the pun.
Yes, very hair-raising. My very favorite, though, comes from the mid-19th century when American ethnologist George Gibbs gave us the following. Now, the interesting thing about this account that I'm going to share is that he had compiled a great big volume, all of the languages of various indigenous American tribes of the Pacific Northwest that he'd encountered in Oregon and other places. There was a portion of the manuscript that was omitted. And then back in the I think it was about 1945, I think his great-grandniece passed it along to a historical society in Oregon, and they ended up actually publishing it, this unpublished portion of his original manuscript. So this portion that otherwise would have been lost to history contains some really interesting elaborations on some of the terms that appeared in the book, one of those being the word Siatic. And this is the redacted account, if you will, the unincluded portion of the book that later came to light.
The excluded middle.
Yeah, well, this isn't the entire thing that was excluded. There was this whole section, but in that section that had been excluded that later turns up, literally almost 100 years after the book's published, we have the following. "One other race of beings I have classed separately, as they are in particular supposed to infest the earth, and do not appear to have been properly elliptilicum." Now, what he's describing here is elliptilicum essentially are spirit folk, in the beliefs among the Upper Chehalis, the Klickitat and other tribes in this region. But he's saying there's another race of beings that don't seem to be really spirit folk. I mean, and when he's describing this, they're supposed to infest the earth. He's saying,
We're
I mean,
not talking about the fae folk or the fairies.
yeah,
Now.
this seems to be like a something physical and tangible that they're describing. So he goes on to say they are the Siatko, and then he gives some different names according to the various different tribes. He says the belief in these beings is apparently universal among the different tribes, though there is a great discrepancy in their accounts of them. By some, the Siatko are described as of gigantic size, their feet 18 inches long and shaped like a bear's. They wear no clothes, but the body is covered with hair like that of a dog, only not so thick. Others describe them as of natural size and resembling men, except that they gibber and chatter, one Siatko making noise enough to represent a dozen persons. They are said to live in the mountains and holes underground and to smell badly. They come down chiefly in the fishing season, at which time the Indians are excessively afraid of them. At the report of Siatko, they all run for their houses, fire their guns, and shout. Now, again, at the report of Siatko, he seems to be describing it, the sound, the call that they make, the noise associated with them. He goes on to say they are visible only at night, at which time they approach the houses, steal salmon, carry off young girls, and smother children. Their voices are like those of the owl, and they possess the power of charming, so that those hearing them become demented or fall down in a swoon. Now, it seems pretty evident that there are some pretty supernatural attributes given to the Siatko in this account. But I mean, you compare that, for instance, to the account from 1840, where among the Spokane, Elkanah Walker is describing this race of giants that inhabit this mountain somewhere off to the west. Walker's account from 1840 never describes hair on the bodies of the giants, but in every other aspect, they sound very much like the Siatko that George Gibbs gives us in 1850 or so. And he does describe them as being covered in hair kind of like dogs, except not quite as thick as a dog's hair. These creatures, steal salmon. Sometimes they steal women. These things come mostly at night. They're nocturnal, essentially. When people hear them, they start shooting their guns and they start screaming because they're scared. They don't want to see these things.
Mm-hmm.
They smell foully. They have 18-inch footprints, which is another fascinating point because, I mean, that specific length, I think, is almost a perfect match for the length of some of the footprints that were, and these, keep in mind, actually hoaxes, presumably by the Wallace boys at Bluff Creek back in the 1950s. But, I mean, predating that by several, decades, and actually at that point, a century just about, we have these so specific in their detail, 18-inch footprints. And I'm like, gosh, that's so Sasquatch, So again, in my view, in addition to the government angle on this, where there's really potentially an untapped resource for information that could help us establish the history of these phenomena, if you want to class them as such, indigenous American folklore, although I think you need to be very cautious in that area not to appropriate a traditional indigenous American belief, and mold that into matching a modern, belief. You got to be very careful about those things. But in some instances, there not only appear to be good matches, but according to the indigenous representatives, they say, look, that's exactly what we're talking about. If you go back to the 1930s, when the Chehalis used to hold their Sasquatch Days festival, and keep in mind, it was only called the Sasquatch Days probably after that anglicized version of the word Sasquatch first appeared in print in 1929 when J.W. Burns used it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's quickly what they started calling the festival, where indigenous groups would get together and they would, they would hold their ceremonies where they would have a guy. If you look at the pictures from the 1930s, again, for the skeptics who say, they only believed that the creatures were giant Indians. They never ever said that these things were hairy back then.
Mm-hmm.
You can find pictures. A recent National Geographic article carried an article or rather had an image from the Sasquatch Days Festival around 1935, and it shows a guy. It looks like he's like a really bad Chewbacca costume, right? I mean, but it's obviously a monkey-like costume that this guy's wearing, and this is their depiction of Sasquatch. And the story that's famously told. Now my lights are flickering. Let's hope I don't lose power.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, let's see if it's my turn now. But anyway, but the story that J.W. Burns told in one of his articles was that a guy kind of comes out at the start of the festival, and he's kind of, saying, we really appreciate everybody coming out here today, and we really are going to have a great time learning about the Chehalis and their beliefs and their folklore about the Sasquatch. And one of the elders gets up and he's mad, and he says, you people don't know jack. He says, you keep talking about our folklore. He says, the Sasquatch isn't folklore. He says, y'all talk like, we don't know what the heck we're, our people who have lived here for generations and who have experienced and known all about, you talk like they don't know anything. You people, you white people are the ones who are crazy not to recognize what we've tried to tell you. You keep saying folklore. We're telling you Sasquatch is here.
It's a real thing.
Yeah. They're like right there, like that mountain. That's where you find them. They're right there, And so, I mean, they were very adamant in saying, don't tell us what our legends mean. In fact, don't call the things we know to exist legends. So to me, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. You got to be very, very careful not to appropriate their mythology and make it what you want it to be. And that goes both ways.
Absolutely.
You know what I'm saying? To truly show respect, I think, we really need to understand the indigenous perspective. And in some instances, it is folklore, but in some instances, there have been adamant proponents among the indigenous, cultures that uphold those aspects of their traditions. And they have said, you guys call that folklore and that's something else. So again, George Gibbs, going back to his account from the 1850s, when he's saying that, they seem not to be what was the term that he used for it? Elliptilicum, I think was the term. Yeah, elliptilicum. He says, these are not spirit folk in their tradition. These seem to be something they're describing that is like they believe it to be a race that infests the earth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of bizarre humanoids, another guest that we have on once a month is Albert Rosales, who always regales us with great accounts of the humanoids that sometimes accompany UFOs. Do you think that some of these accounts are credible? And if so, which ones are the most?
Well, that's an interesting question to ask in the context of what we've been talking about with Sasquatch, because I'm a huge fan of Wendy Connor's Faded Discs collection of audio that you can find on archive.org. And, really, sorry, there's a dog barking in the background. I'm hoping that's not like cutting through the microphone.
Can't hear it.
Okay, cool. As long as we're good, I'll just try to ignore it. But probably just barking at the Sasquatch on the mountain behind me here.
That's right.
Yes, but I love the old audio, and Wendy Connors just did an incredible job collecting all this data. But she has separate playlists of audio, right? Like Project Blue Book History, High Strangeness, which is like interviews with John Keel and stuff like this. But there's one all about.
That'd be great.
Yeah, have you heard these before?
No.
Oh, I'll send you a link, because these are all classic archival audios. I mean, you got hours and hours and hours of stuff to listen through. There's an entire playlist that's nothing but Donald Kehoe interviews. And some of that stuff starts getting a little bit redundant, because, it's like, you'll have Donald Kehoe and then a week later him talking about the same book, where he's on another radio show.
Mm-hmm.
So, but then again, you also got really important instances like when Donald Kehoe tried to go off the script on that. Oh, what was it? It was the, I can't remember the name of the program right this moment, but he's on television, goes off script, and they cut his mic down.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Because the Air Force had reportedly been trying to, control the script. I've got the audio right here. We could even hear that, and you shouldn't get a copyright claim on that. But
you never know.
Yeah, I was able to play it on Jimmy Church's show one time, and we didn't get in too much trouble. But anyway,
if you uploaded it to YouTube, then I probably couldn't play it.
Yeah, right. Tell you, I just don't take any chances with YouTube anymore. But back to the humanoid you asked about. Wendy's got a great collection, just an entire playlist of humanoid encounters. And in that humanoid encounters playlist, because it was initially reported to the National UFO Reporting Center and not back, this is prior to when Peter Davenport had it. It was Robert Gribble who ran the UFO Reporting Center back. You remember? I'm sure you remember this. Did you ever meet Gribble, by the way?
No.
I never met him either. I don't know if he's still alive, but he would be a really interesting person to talk to because he originally ran the reporting center, and a lot of those old recordings of his days at the center have now been made available. So in the midst of all these reports that he would receive of UFOs, a couple of guys call because they don't know who else to call. They've been camping up at a lake up in the California mountains, and that they saw this 10-foot tall hairy thing, and they report it to New Fork. So you know, in terms of like we could it's not to say that they're all the same thing, but in the broader sense of Forteana, we could say that whether it be UFOnauts, right, to borrow, I guess, the term that Hans Holzer and some of the others used in the classic literature, although a lot of people use that. I think even Hynek referred to them at times
that's one of the words that Albert uses is UFOnauts.
Yeah, UFOnauts. I've heard some other even more interesting ones recently that I can't remember all the
like crypto-terrestrials and etc.
Well, you know, Tim Schwartz and I had a really good talk about the crypto-terrestrial component the other day. Call them what you want, but my point would be that we could make a broad umbrella and put all kinds of, you know, humanoids, anthropoid shape that are not human per se. You know, mysterious encounters with humanoids. You could put all this within a single, you know, category, a fairly broad category, but a category nonetheless, non-human humanoids. So that's really kind of what we've been talking about tonight. So we might as well move on. Yeah, there's some really credible ones. The classic case, of course, 1964 in April at Socorro, New Mexico, which did not meet the criteria for a really good UFO case in every way, if you think about it, because generally Hynek and the guys, and Blue Book investigators for that matter, they said, you know, you need to have multiple witnesses. And if it was a single witness case, especially one so crazy as one like what Zamora claimed he saw, which involved occupants outside the craft, that almost invariably would have been dismissed back in those days, especially.
And they dismissed repeaters.
Well, yeah, that too, yeah. And keep in mind that too, all during the years of Hector Quintanilla, who, you know, I've done quite a lot of reading about Quintanilla. And, you know, Quintanilla, when you had the Minot incident of 1968, keep in mind there was also one in 60. There was the one in 66 where David Schindel was there, and they shut off the ICBMs. In 68, there was an incident where several ground personnel saw an object in the sky, and then the B-52H Stratofortress was coming in, and it got vectored out there to try and see the thing. And that's the aircraft that got the radar scope images of the UAP. And then the thing flew down and it landed, and they went back out there. They were coming in on final approach for landing, and they said, "Guys, you got fuel? Go back. We want you to go photograph it." And they're like, "Great,
right, go back up."
Go back out, you know, and they see the light on the ground, and they go out and they fly and they bank over the object that's on the ground. And as they bank over it, the co-pilot looks through the window. He says, "I mean, we can clearly see an egg-shaped object that was glowing, with like this kind of extension coming out the front, and then this kind of a like half moon, kind of a crescent moon shaped appendage out in front of this egg portion that he said reminded him of like a bumper." Very interesting description, which is not unlike, by the way, the descriptions of the objects, at least to me, that were described in the 1954 Madagascar Tananarive incident, which when it was French Madagascar, these two green objects come flying over making no sound, but they were described as sort of similar in appearance. Lo and behold, the portion on the front of the Minot UFO, that bumper portion, was emitting a greenish light, according to the co-pilot, just like the objects seen over Tananarive. So, I mean, that's fascinating to me, these little bits and pieces. Now, there weren't, you know, humanoids that were observed in either of those cases, but in the Minot incident, there is something interesting about that almost hints at it. So we could call this like a pre-humanoid case, right? The night of the incident, one of their missile launch facilities on the ground. They've got two warning systems, an outdoor and an indoor, or an outer perimeter and an inner perimeter.
Which is probably more of a, upper and a lower, but either way.
Yeah. But in any case, if they got either of those went off and they're like, okay, probably just a rabbit running, especially if it's an outer perimeter warning. But if they get an outer and then an inner perimeter warning, it seems to indicate that something, triggered the outer sensors, went in, triggered the second sensor, and that is cause for alarm. So they, in those instances, immediately go and investigate. The night of the 1968 UFO incident at Minot Air Force Base, literally within minutes of the B-52 landing, and they begin to debrief the pilot and they start doing their investigations. They get an outer and an inner perimeter warning at one of the launch complexes, drive out there, and they see that the latch had been unlocked and left undone. Now, there's a former military member of the military who in the early 1970s, and he knows it was them because he knows the years he was in service, but he's uncertain about the exact date. But the same thing happened while he was stationed at Minot, and he reached out to me and has agreed to speak with me about that. But he said he was interrogated by Air Force Office of Special Investigation about the incident. And they didn't think he'd done it or anything, but they were asking everybody, they're like, who keeps going into this facility? Who has the ability to enter our locked facility?
Right.
And they chalked it up to saying, it's probably just disgruntled former Air Forcemen who had a key who were going out there and just pranking everybody. But I'm like, and this guy said the same thing. He says, it seemed like when that happened, there had been UFO sightings around the time that this. So, it almost hints at there being a ground component at some of these northern tier incidents where a UFO is seen in the sky. Meanwhile, something's going on the ground too, and they know our combinations, or they got a key and they can get into our facilities. What the hell is going on with that?
Yeah. On one hand, they must have been terrified, and on the other hand, they must have been bemused.
Well, sure. Now Project Blue Book, of course, they knew about the whole situation with the locks, and they said that seemed to have absolutely nothing to do with the UFO sighting. But what they didn't know at that time, and what many researchers don't know, is that that happened more than once, and seemingly every time it happened, it was coinciding with UFO sightings. So I've actually wondered about that. And again, one of those sources has never appeared in any documentaries or books or anything. He reached out to me personally and said, before I pass away, I have a story.
He wants to remain anonymous, I take it.
I don't know if he'd remain anonymous. I'm not using his name here publicly just because he hasn't said, yeah, you can use my name, but I didn't get the impression he would mind. He wrote to me because he's a listener of my shows, and he just basically said, I'd like to share this before I get too much older, because your memory tends to, not get better with time.
Sure.
And he said, I'd like to just write this all out and send it to somebody like yourself who I think might
that's really neat.
Yeah, and he said, now I don't know if this has ever happened before, but it happened to me. He says, do you think this would be worth a FOIA? And I'm like, well, it might be, but lo and damn behold, that did happen more than once. And yes, it did coincide with other UFO incidents.
Right. Yeah.
So the Blue Book conclusion that had nothing to do with the sighting of the UFOs, which, keep in mind, that was also during the Quintanilla era. And their explanation had been, well, the people on the ground were seeing a star. It was probably Sirius. The plane, when it was flying over, was probably just taking a photograph of Vega through their radar scope. As for the disturbance that seemed to shut down their radar communications with RAPCOM, that was a ball lightning plasma. This is a rare atmospheric phenomena that occurs only under certain. This is for real what they actually said in the report.
Yeah, and there are 2 documented photographs of ball lightning, and there are 10,000 of UFOs.
Look, they had more photographs of the UAP that they said had been tailing them off their left wing than there existed at that time of ball lightning. Mm-hmm. But they were trying to make the argument that ball lightning, which none of the pilots or anybody else had seen, mind you, mm-hmm. had caused interference that cut off their radio relay to RAPCOM. And I'm like, this is the most astonishingly stupid group of ridiculous explanations. I mean, it couldn't just be one thing. It had to be a combination of ball lightning, one of the rarest atmospheric phenomena that exists, along with people seeing stars and everything else.
And
that they
planet Venus, probably. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's just absurd. So, but anyway, coming back to humanoids, I mentioned the Minot case just because it's almost implied that there was a sort of something going on the ground where somebody would have had to have gone in and disabled locks to go into a facility, which has always kind of bothered me. But with regard to credible sightings, Zamora's case was allowed, even though it didn't have the multiple witness and other criteria, because they said that the witness was unimpeachable. Here we didn't have a repeater. We didn't have a person who even cared about UFOs. He didn't want to talk really about the one that he saw. He's a police officer. It was a broad daylight sighting, and he said he saw two individuals outside this egg before it took off. I have to say it is a pretty good case, but again, his sighting, and this is important, his visual observation was corroborated by the landing traces left by the craft.
Didn't he say later that he wishes that he'd never reported it?
Oh, yeah. Lonnie was so troubled after what he saw that he couldn't sleep at night. He tried to go to sleep and would just keep. He was pretty scared by the craft because he said it made this loud as it like lifted up into the sky, and then it was down in this depression, an arroyo, and his car was parked up on the hill where there was the road, and there was a ridge that went on up beyond where the road was. And when he sees the thing start rising out of the arroyo, he gets out immediately and starts running up the hill and kind of ducks down behind the hill, puts his arms up and starts to watch. But then about that time, the thing is level with his car, stops making noise, and he says it just kind of flies off silently, only a few feet above the ground, misses the TNT shack that's over there in the distance by about 8 feet, clears that, keeps going, and it goes right on up the side of a mountain and over the top, and then just vanishes. So what it sounds like is happening is this craft is intentionally flying very close to the Earth. And that seems to indicate to me it's trying to fly quite literally below the radar. This is an aircraft that's operating in such a way that it's going to try and avoid. Why would it be doing that in that region? You got
that hadn't occurred to me when you were describing it, Micah. I was thinking maybe it had something to do with the electromagnetic gravitic propulsion along with telluric currents of the Earth, that sort of thing.
Well, I've wondered about that too. That certainly, the way that it flies alongside the Earth at such close distance, that certainly, that thought had crossed my mind. But given the proximity to White Sands, and what's the actual Air Force base right there too?
Test site. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seemed very evident to me that aircraft was going to try and literally avoid radar. And in a lot of UAP cases, when the things are flying so low, I think that's exactly what's happening. These are aircraft that are flying below radar propagation.
That never occurred to me.
Yeah,
that's very, very interesting.
Well, they clearly know what's going on, and they operate and behave in a way that is conducive to maintaining a low.
Yeah, and then on one hand, they seem like they're trying to avoid detection. In a lot of cases, they have stealth properties where you can't see them, or you can only see them with infrared. And then on the other hand, you've got situations where they almost seem to make presentations to one or two people that wouldn't ever be taken seriously, almost.
Yeah, the 1966 incident where the officer David Spower and the police officers chased the thing through Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
That incident is fascinating. I did an episode about it on my podcast a few weeks back.
This is the one where they had the radio through the different counties as it went.
What happened was, they were in hot pursuit, and as they were going through different counties, they were trying to find other officers who were on duty at the night shift at that time. Spower and Buck, I can't remember his last name, but the other patrol, Barney, his name wasn't Buck, it was Barney something. But anyway, he was the mounted officer who was, serving as basically the ride along with officer or Deputy Spower that night. So they see the thing, they're outside their vehicle, and the thing just comes over them almost noiseless, except it makes kind of like a power station kind of buzzing. And it's bright enough that they can't really make out any details apart from the fact that it's just this bright light hovering directly over them. And they're like, oh my God. And Spower says, the first thing I do is I look down to see if I'm on fire or anything. He says, and I noticed I wasn't fire. So then, Barney and I kind of look at each other, and we just immediately go get in the car, and we're sitting in the car, and then we're like, Okay, what now? And the thing kind of hovers and it kind of goes off and then it kind of sits there and then it just kind of goes off down the road. And so they're at that point getting in touch with dispatch and they're going, that UFO that the woman reported a few minutes ago, we've got the thing. They're like, you've got it. He's like, we've got a visual. I mean, it's like right here. And they said, well, chase it. And he said, we were scared, but he says at that point, we're just like, okay, God, all right. So they start driving after the thing. And after a few minutes, they realize it's not very likely that this thing's going to try and hurt them. So they're following it. And they're pacing the thing, driving anywhere between 80 and 100 miles an hour going down the road. And they said that at various times, this aircraft traveling as the crow flies, they would meet obstructions in the road where they have to drive around it and they would kind of lose it. And if it got off in the distance, it would stop and wait for them.
Mm-hmm.
And then once they were able to pick up and everything and resume their speed, it would start, the object would start to move and keep always a constant distance from them.
So it couldn't get too far away.
Yeah, but if they did start to lose it, it would sit. And he says at one point we came up over a hill and everything, and I'll be damned, we get up over the hill and we thought we'd lost it, and it was sitting down there, hovering over the road, waiting for us. And as soon as we caught back up to it, it starts driving again. I'm like, man, what in the hell? So, again, there are a lot of interesting criteria that emerge here. They're operating seemingly in stealth, but at times they appear. I mean, I kind of like to imagine if you could hear what was going on board the aircraft. It's like a bunch of teenagers. They're like laughing at this police car. Yeah. And then two police cars, and they're just
alien beer cans kind of coming off of it.
Yeah, they're just like a bunch of drunk aliens, I wonder sometimes what's going on. So the behaviors associated with UAP, again, all these things are kind of like predecessors to the credible human reports. 1966, we have that sighting from where was that? Let me see here. If I can pull up a note, I can probably find the thing. This is a case that Ryan Sprague had recently told me that he had never heard this case before. And I find it very interesting. It happened in 1960, I think it was 64. Let me see here. I'll find it in my notes. Yeah, here we go. Well, first of all, actually, if we're going to talk about credible humanoids, not 1973, it was 1979. Bowiani, Papua New Guinea, when Father William Booth Gill.
Oh, yeah.
When they observed the saucer for 2 nights hovering up over Papua New Guinea, and they see the clearly humanoids walk around up top, they seem to be wearing white kind of coverall suits. It's very consistent with what Lonnie Zamora described. And when they waved at the beings, one of them looked down and waved back. Father Gill said that the thing waved back at him.
Mm-hmm. I remember hearing you talk about that on the Graylian report.
Yeah, it was probably a long time back, but I've recently revisited this a lot because, I'm fascinated with, and actually I think that we're back to this point. NICAP back in the day never wanted to talk about humanoid reports, and I kind of got the impression that they gave Walter Webb some guff when he investigated the Betty and Barney Hill sighting. Now, the Betty and Barney Hill sighting is fascinating to me because, and we've talked about it plenty, so I'm not going to go too far down that rabbit hole, but just to mention a humanoid report, I do think it's a credible humanoid observation. And I'm not discounting the abduction part, but this kind of comes back to what I was discussing earlier, where certain parts of these UAP or other kind of phenomena that we discuss, certain parts of these narratives fall into lower information zones. And you got to deal with the aspects of the case that you can more reliably work with. Now,
sure.
In the case of the Barney and Betty Hill abduction, before they ever went to Benjamin Simon and received any kind of hypnotic regressions or anything, before Betty had begun writing her dreams down, Walter Webb, they had contacted Peace Air Force Base and reported it.
Right.
And then Walter Webb, I can't remember if I know what it was. Betty went to the library trying to learn more about what was going on, found one of Kehoe's books, contacted NICAP. They sent Walter Webb down, who was a young astronomer. Right. He goes down and he interviews him. His original report, Fran Ridge, at the NICAP.org website, if you know where to look on that website, the old original copy, not of the updated post-hypnosis portion, but the pre-hypnosis original report by Webb, which is the first primary source document we have where Betty and Barney describe seeing the occupants. Barney does. Betty didn't really see them, but Barney gives a very vivid description of seeing the men on board the craft.
Mm-hmm.
That was all before. He remembered seeing all
That
of
was
that.
all game memory. Yeah.
Yeah, so I say, and this is kind of how Webb dealt with it. Webb, in his second version of the report, where he talks about the hypnosis, he's kind of saying, we don't really know yet what to do with that part of this story. But up until then, their immediate recollection of what they said happened that night is still, in our view, a very good report. And I agree, that is a pretty interesting account, because the way that Barney described those humanoids, he said there was nothing grotesque or ghastly. They just kind of looked like people. Kind of like what in Temple, Oklahoma, in 1966, William Laxton described seeing when he saw a landed fish-shaped aircraft in the road in front of him. This was early in the morning on his way into work.
Isn't it funny how many of them land in the middle of the road?
Well, again, coming back to your point, Gil, about like them seeming to give a display to people. Now on the one hand, landing in a road might make sense, because if you got an area with a lot of like vegetation and stuff, and you need a flat surface, a roadway is going to be perfect.
Sure.
But by the other,
so could the top of the hill.
Yeah, exactly. But so in any case, Laxton, he pulls up and he sees this thing blocking the road, and so he kind of slows down. He describes it as being fish-shaped. He said it had a plastic bubble in front, about 1 meter in diameter. He could see light through it. This bared the similarity to him to the cockpit of a B-26. He saw a kind of stabilizer tail at the back with numbers and letters painted on a dark circular window. Now, keep in mind, numbers or letters painted on a dark circular window. Laxton, whose memory his friends would always say that he was very good about being able to remember things, Laxton later remembered that he thought that the initials TL and maybe the number 47 or 41 and the number 68 had been the number sequence that he saw on this window. Beneath the aircraft, though, and this is the important part. Now, first of all, that aircraft to me doesn't sound unlike a modern fighter jet, but this was in 1966. So one has to ask, was this some sort of a prototype or something? Well, look, what happens next is really interesting, because then out from under the aircraft with a flashlight in his hands, he sees a guy who he believes is probably about, 5.5 feet tall. He says this guy looks like he's about 30 to 35 years old. And he says, if I saw him in a bar, I'd recognize him right now. This guy was wearing a two-piece suit, like a green military uniform. He had a baseball cap or like a bill type cap on. He said that he thought that there were like on the sleeve, like 3 bands above and 3 bands below it. Right. And the man, when he saw Laxton pull up, he goes, nope. And he goes up into a little hatch. He says the aircraft produced a noise like a drill running at high speed, and it rose off the ground about 15 feet and then flew away quickly, leaving static electricity in the air. Now that, to me, is one of my favorite credible humanoid encounters, because it sounds like a super kind of like modern Harrier type jet or something. You didn't seem to have an aircraft that could do that, let alone land in a road in the 1960s, but it sounds like an undeniably human occupant.
It does.
Yeah, and that's a really good case. There was another one, though, that really stood out to me, and this isn't a well-known case. In 1978 at Yukon, Oklahoma, there was a state worker who was like a weather reporter, and this reporter contacted Robert Gribble at the National UFO Reporting Center, and I've played this audio on my show before. This guy, he calls into Gribble and he says, I work with Oklahoma County React Unit number 10. And he's just like, no BS. I mean, he just lays out the time was, the estimated distance from the object was this. We noted that the time that the object dropped down was, this guy was a trained observer and he had taken notes.
Right.
At one point, what they describe is that in this field, they see this saucer come down. And they weren't sure if it landed or if it was just sort of hovering right next to the ground. But at one point, a light opens up and a figure comes out. The figure is a humanoid shape. They say that it would look like it was maybe between 3.5 and maybe 4.5 feet tall. It seemed to have a slightly larger head in proportion to the rest of the body. The arms were slightly longer in length in proportion to the body than a human's arms would be. And they said this individual stepped out of that craft and went off into the field. And then when that aircraft took off, it went and just went straight up, no sound. And they said that individual never got back on board that craft. I mean, But this guy is, again, you talk about an unimpeachable witness. I want to try and see if I can track down who the hell this guy. He must have only been in his 20s or 30s in the 70s, and he could probably still be alive.
Oh, sure.
I want to find this witness.
Right.
Because he said there were about 10 of us out there. We were all along a highway. Everybody had binoculars. We were all watching this aircraft or object as it dropped down. We observed this individual come off this vehicle. It went back up, and that person never got back on. So
they left one behind.
Well, I mean, I've wondered, did it go around the other side and go back in another door? Yeah. I mean, I don't know, but there are very good reports involving humanoid occupants of UAP that are not related, presumably in any way, to abductions, missing time, or hypnosis. And I really think that more focus should be put on those cases because, they could tell us something about the broader UAP issue. And although I'm not all in on the whole time traveler notion, my colleague, Dr. Michael Masters, makes some really interesting observations about how similar they are to people, humans, and how unlikely that would be in terms of, astrobiological evolutionary paths that, life would be likely to take on other planets. He says that the fact that they're so human-like in appearance, but not us, is a clue. And frankly, he says it's almost a giveaway that what we're dealing with is something probably that has a whole lot more to do with Earth than we realize. And it may, you never know. All bets are off. All theories are still on the table. But
my good friend Mark Davenport, back in the 90s, wrote Visitors from Time, Secret of the UFOs. And his theory was that they were us from the future and that they had hit a genetic dead end and they were coming back for DNA.
Well, it's interesting because I entertain that theory sort of. I kind of skirted it in the UFO Singularity, the book that I wrote back in 2013, which, again, there were some critics of that who said, there's no more evidence this is time travel than there is anything else, Hanks. And I said, well, I'm not saying that I think it's time travel per se. More than anything, I'm just trying to say that if we had, for instance, extraterrestrials who are traveling great interstellar distances to get here, and they're able to manipulate gravity in some way that, we have not yet learned to do, the manipulation of gravity, or in any case, travel around it. If we're talking about some sort of a, craft that warps space around the object more so than it actually travels through space, so as to overcome, G-forces and other issues, dilation, time dilation, other problems maybe that space travelers over great distances would be met with. If they're doing this in some way, you almost can't have one without the other. You can't manipulate gravity without manipulating time.
It almost kind of explains a lot.
Well, yeah, and so that's what I'm trying to say is that they may not be time travelers per se, but there may be a temporal component to the way that their technology works.
Yeah.
And Dr. Masters points out something really, really cool that I thought was fascinating. Everybody talks about the accelerated tree ring growth and things like this at landing sites like where Travis Walton allegedly was picked up back in the 70s. And Masters says, what if the accelerated tree ring, or the dendrochronological anomaly that's observed that seems to show a accelerated growth of the trees, what if that was in relation to a warpage of time around that object at that time?
Right.
There are UFO landing sites where, rather than physical disturbances of the soil, they find that the grass has grown more in the area where the UFOs landed. And I'm like, that's really interesting.
I don't know how far this is away from me, but of course, the very famous Delphos, Kansas case still has a ring there.
Yeah. So one has to wonder, is there potentially, and again, rather than calling it time travel, I called it atemporal.
Space-time warping.
Yeah, I refer to it as atemporal. Mike calls it extratempestrial, but I think we all kind of are referring to the same thing. A component related to the unique relationship between gravity and time as observed in accordance with general relativity is what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's a separate physics than what we understand currently, I think.
It's probably entirely in keeping with everything we know about it physics, but in a way that utilizes those principles beyond any technologies that we currently have at our
Yeah, it's
disposal.
more advanced than what we use. Yeah.
But who knows? Maybe they could be time travelers. Maybe they could be, and if they are time travelers, maybe they're going back in time and just to frick with us, they're just going back and they're picking up Gigantopithecus black eye from the Pleistocene, and they're dropping those babies off in North America.
Right.
Let's mess with them. Let's throw
They
a
got
great big
Elvis
ape
on the UFO.
Let's see what they do if we throw a big old monkey at them for a minute.
I don't think you believe that for a minute, but it is funny.
No, but I'm not afraid to speculate at times.
Yeah. And then speaking of speculation, I think it's about time that we speculate a mod to come on and bring a giveaway wheel with them, so that we can give away a copy of the Ghost Rocket. Yes, an autographed copy for our lucky weekly winner. So calling all mods, all mod cons.
We need a mod now.
Yes, indeed. Bring the wheel of Gil. Speaking of mods, yes. I like those. They're quite fetching on you.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, these are the Ray-Ban, what are they? The new Wayfarer.
Mm-hmm.
Normally it would be like classic all the way, but I don't know. I went with these this time. They're very comfortable, though. That's what everybody says. Everybody says they're just very, very comfortable, kind of a modern rendition on the classic, Ray-Ban.
Yep. Yep. The old Tom Cruise glasses.
Yep, that's right. Yeah. So, and the hits just keep on coming.
And speaking of hits, welcome Darius Munchausen. Hello,
Darius.
Hail, Cardinal Sen. Hail, Micah.
Hail.
And welcome back again.
Good to see you, my friend. How you been?
Yeah, pretty good. And it's always a pleasure to have Micah on. He's one of our favorite guests.
Oh, of course.
Well, I wish I felt the same. I don't like him at all.
You have a wheel with you?
I do. Thanks to Jill for setting up all the code and plugging in the tubes.
Well,
we have a wheel populated by
we have a few people on there.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Well, let's give it a spin. Yeah.
All right, here we go.
Oh, so close.
Oh,
radioactive.
Congratulations.
That's fantastic.
Well, I will make sure if you have not already,
Radioactive's information to you, Micah, so that you can send that book off. And thanks again so much, Darius, for helping us out with that wheel.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Thank you, Darius.
That was wonderful. Congratulations.
Well, thank you, Micah, for offering it.
Oh, yes.
Yes,
indeed.
Thank you, Micah, obviously. And thank you for being on the show. Where can people find more of the stuff that you do and buy your books and all that good stuff?
Oh, gosh. Well, since we discussed Sasquatch a fair amount tonight, there's the supplemental podcast I do, Sasquatch Tracks. Those guys, Jeffrey and Smokey, my co-hosts, they're going to be coming with me up to CryptidCon in a few weeks. So anybody in the Kentucky area, if you want to come up there and join us at CryptidCon, we'd love to see you there. Come by the table and say hello. I'm giving a talk on Sunday afternoon all about the government research I've been doing into that. But if you want to follow my general work, it's micahhanks.com is my website. You can find all my podcasts there. And then, of course, the reporting that we do on science, technology, UAP, and much more over at thedebrief.org. I think that's pretty much everything. But if you really look around online, you'll find all kinds of stuff. I can't stay out of trouble. So
and that's
articles,
that's
podcasts.
Right.
I mean,
one of these days, we will have to have a dad juice together, Micah.
I sincerely hope so, yes. And please invite Darius as well.
We will.
Oh,
if I can drag him along, I will.
It'd be a pleasure. A pleasure indeed.
Indeed. All right. Well, thanks again, and we will see you next month. Thanks to everybody that was here, and congratulations again to Radioactive. And I am going to go ahead and call it. It is Cardinal Sin out.